Imagine, or in some cases, remember playing games in the 90s. All sorts of new genres are being created, and technology is advancing at a mind-blowing rate. What started out as a little dude with a sword and shield clearing screen after screen of enemies is now an epic adventure with lots of characters to meet, places to see, and secrets to uncover. Almost everything you know is changing, evolving, and for the most part, it's only getting better. Doom's fake 3D was shortly replaced by Quake stepping into the third dimension and doing things that were literally impossible just a few years before. Valve then takes Quake's engine and modifies it to create Half-Life, a game that would forever change the direction of mainstream FPS games by showing that story is not just something you quickly slap together and put on a card at the end of the episode. You get the point. If you skipped from 90s to any other decade, many genres and franchises would be so different from what they used to be that you probably wouldn't even recognize them, except for fighting games. Fighting games got bigger. What was already there is now more robust and expensive, but it's still the same. And I'm not talking about systems and mechanics here. We're doing just fine on that end, actually. 2D, 3D, anime, arena, platform, assist-based, team-based, turn-based, chess-based. Anyway, there's enough gameplay variety. That's why the focus of this video is on single player and the frankly embarrassing state of it. People who expect content outside PvP usually get nothing, if not less. And even when you have a powerhouse like Capcom promising a fully fleshed out single player mode, you only get a disappointing mess. But before we dive into that, let's talk about why we're in this situation to begin with. You don't need to be a detective to locate the roots of this problem. Despite arcades slowly going out of business and fighting games moving to PC and consoles, the influence of these bulky cabinets has latched onto fighting games like a parasite. When developers were making their first step towards bringing their games onto home consoles, many of them didn't think of anything better than, well, doing nothing. At that point, it was either inferior ports or games that simply replicated the features of their arcade counterparts. Tekken and Mortal Kombat were among the first series to recognize that you can't just put arcade games on home consoles and expect good sales. They needed something else, with both titles electing to add more single-player modes and features first and foremost. This would eventually give us the classics like Tekken Ball and Tekken Force. The former was terrible against bots, but Tekken Force is still a fantastic example of doing a lot with very little. They took the existing mechanics and simply used them to create a unique mode that was fun to play by yourself. One of the original Virtua Fighter and Tekken game designers, Seiichi Ishii, would then go on to produce Tobal games. If you're not familiar, it was a series of 3D fighters similar to Tekken, but the most interesting part about them is what they did in single player. The original had a fairly novel dungeon crawler style mode, while the sequel fleshed it out into a somewhat open world RPG. Crazier yet, you could capture any mob in the game and then use them in 1v1 fights, technically giving you 200 playable characters. Now, some of them were clones, and many of them only had a few basic moves. But still, was the single player good? Well, you probably wouldn't play that in 2023, but let's stop for a second here. The last Tobal game came out in 1997, and that's the same for Tekken 3. In that time, dozens of fighting games have come out. How many of them had a single player or story mode that is even half as innovative or unique as Tekken Force or Tobal's Quest mode? I would guess that even if you can name at least 5 titles, all or most of them will be the very modern attempts that we saw in the last few years. That, or you're just thinking about Tekken 5 and 6, games that sort of tried to expand on Tekken Force in their own way. If not, let me know in the comments. I would love to know if there's any examples that can destroy this argument. But until then, this really underlines just how stagnant this genre has gotten, and stagnation is putting it lightly. Some games never have had much of a single player going on, or they just maintain what they sort of already had going, like Dead or Alive or Virtua Fighter. But for other titles, sometimes it's just an outright regression. The aforementioned Tekken games from 4 to 6 kept trying to flesh out the Tekken Force. They kept adding things to make this mode into something truly worthwhile. Then Tekken 7 comes along and gives us this.
I remember receiving my first letter from my son a few years back. Scribbled on it were the words, "I love you." I was so happy, I cried.
Maybe they had fun side modes. Oh man, you're not ready for this. This is a DLC. You had to pay for this. It's not even that it's bad. It's goofy, it can be funny, and that's fine, but as a DLC, that's just crazy, considering it's still basically just the same mode that we had in Tekken Tag Tournament 1 and Dark Resurrection. Some of this can be excused by Bandai Namco not granting the Tekken team a big enough budget, but surely instead of cinematic cutscenes for Tekken 7, they could have routed those resources towards making a video game instead. This is something where I imagine many people will disagree, but it's why I also consider this general trend of turning story mode into a literal movie to be a regression. For the general gaming industry, this is nothing new. Some of you might remember the stunning, at least at the time, animated cutscenes from 1992's Flashback, or cinematic in-game cutscenes from something like the original Metal Gear Solid. As time advanced, cutscenes both in-engine and pre-rendered only got more elaborate and more common. However, there is a massive gap between how general video games and how fighting games treat cinematics. In the broader industry, scripted scenes and cinematics are usually treated as ways to enhance the gameplay and storytelling, something that needs to be smoothly woven into other elements. For example, the new God of War manages to present well-directed cutscenes without ever cutting away the camera in its over 20 hours of runtime, allowing for sections that focus more heavily on storytelling but flow so naturally that you never feel like they interrupted the gameplay. Fighting games might as well be the complete opposite of that, and it's almost funny how homogenous it all is. The way Tekken 7, Mortal Kombat 1, and Dead or Alive 6 treat their story mode is exactly the same. Cutscene leading up to a fight, player fights against CPU, then the fight is either resolved in the cutscene or treated as if it never even really happened.
You know, I do feel better.
In many cases, you could just remove the gameplay entirely and miss nothing. If anything, watching a choreographed fight would likely be more entertaining than pretending that fighting a poorly designed AI is fun. There are flashes of something unique with the in-game character mashups in MK1, or with the kid Kazuya trying to attack unmovable Heihachi at the start of Tekken 7, but moments like these are few and far between. Instead of a mode where gameplay itself tells a story with unique mechanics, systems, and cutscenes that would feed into the other elements, we're just sitting there and watching a movie. The only kind of gameplay on offer here is an occasional fight against the CPU. And then there's Guilty Gear Strive. I'm not even sure if I should praise it for cutting out the pointless fights, or criticize it for entirely giving up on any sort of gameplay. Many would call this an evolution or an upgrade compared to the old days of just getting a short cutscene after beating the arcade mode. But aren't things meant to improve when they evolve? Are we seriously going to accept that playing less of the game is an improvement? Given how often Mortal Kombat is praised for its story mode, it definitely seems like people are just fine with the current state of things. And maybe it would be fine if those movie modes existed alongside a robust package of gameplay-focused single-player content, instead of being a substitution for it. Looking at the big picture thus far, it definitely seems grim. The game publishers have no ambitions to offer a more complete package for its audience, while the players themselves have become complacent. When nobody tries, you kind of stop expecting more than the bare minimum. It just starts to seem normal. However, it's not all doom and gloom. As I mentioned before, in recent years we have gotten more games that try something new than we had in the last 2 decades. Dim's Fighting Herds, for example, abandoned tradition in favor of doing something entirely original. The game's story was presented as a JRPG-style adventure, with platforming sections and fights against unique enemies and bosses with special mechanics. Grand Blue Fantasy Versus also made an attempt to stay true to its roots with an RPG/beat-em-up hybrid, with loot to find and weapon grids to build. They even had plenty of unique bosses, and most importantly, a co-op mode. It might not seem like much, but being able to play games like these with a friend is always a massive plus. The upcoming GBVS Rising is supposed to expand on that even further with a Fall Guys-style party mode. Mortal Kombat has definitely made an attempt to make something interesting with the Invasion mode. At first, it seemed like a cool board game style mode that could have surprises around every corner, but it turned out to be a very modest collection of minigames sprinkled between hundreds of boring CPU matches against subpar AI, with some occasional modifiers to try and make things less sleep-inducing. They could still turn things around, but the current offer leaves a lot to be desired. Finally, there's the shining gem of single-player content, the World Tour. Touted as being a whole separate game, fully fleshed out and full of content, credit where credit is due, it is probably the biggest and most fleshed out single player mode we've had this far. There is a decent amount of minigames, there are plenty of enemies with unique mechanics to them, there are lots of little references scattered throughout, and in terms of quantity, it simply has a lot of content going on. It's easy to see why people celebrated and praised it so much. When you put it up against basic arcade runs and movie modes, it looks like a powerlifter next to a toddler. The problem is, something like this is only really impressive if you have no frame of reference or hold it to extremely low standards. It's good for a fighting game. Yakuza is a fairly mainstream series at this point, and World Tour is like playing Yakuza, but worse in every conceivable way. Despite being comparatively smaller, Metro City does not encourage exploration. Instead of walking about a densely packed world, you're running around parking lots and generic streets that feel like they came straight off some asset pack. There's a stark contrast between points of interest and everything that surrounds them. There are no amusing side quests with zany NPCs either. They are almost entirely made out of thinly disguised tutorials and info dumps. You'd think that all the effort went into the main quest, but somehow it's an epitome of stock fighting game narrative about a big tournament and the Mr. Big Bad Evil Man using it for his nefarious means. It hasn't even been a year yet, but I bet many of you don't even remember Boschk at this point. That leaves us with nothing but gameplay. Probably the most complex part of the mode. You can somewhat construct your own fighter by combining a set of normals from one character and any special moves from the rest, as long as they don't overlap. You can even have an assist that will briefly help you in a fight. It's fun at first, but the density of fights is so high that it quickly becomes a repetitive chore, even when they are trying to mix it up with unique enemies. It ends up being a mode that has little to offer for experienced players or even fans of the lore, while also being too grindy and repetitive to pull in newcomers who have likely experienced far more entertaining and less padded out titles. While it is undeniably a commendable effort by Capcom and a big step for fighting games going forward, it just shows that even if you far surpass the extremely low standards set by other fighting games, you still have a long way to go before you can stand up to other video games. This is a problem that future fighting games will inevitably have to face and resolve if we expect to see fighting games become truly mainstream. Despite going over so many issues overall, I still have a positive outlook on things going forward. Even if fighting games are sort of late to the party, having flagship titles like Street Fighter and Tekken pay more attention to their single-player content could be a sign of things to come. Nobody can nail things right from the start. We as fighting game players should know that better than anyone. Our skills were developed by falling over and over, but learning something new from each loss. The same way, if fighting games continue to iterate and improve their single player, then things will only get better with time. Right now, they still leave a lot to be desired, but who knows, maybe in a few years we will be launching fighting games and picking a single player mode because it's simply fun, and not just because it's the only way of unlocking other content. Congratulations, you've gotten to the end of the video. We really appreciate it. Let us know in the comments what you thought of today's video. Do you agree? Do you disagree? I look forward to going through them and maybe changing my perspective, maybe not. If you really enjoy our content, we also have a completely revamped Patreon page with plenty of new benefits and more reasonable prices for people who wish to support what we do and learn a little more about fighting games. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.